You're listening to the Think Christian podcast, where we have another one of our book launch episodes. Though, don't worry, pop culture will come into play too, as well as our usual claim that there's no such thing as secular. I'm Josh Larson, editor over at thinkchristian.net and your host. Yes, TC contributors have been pumping the books out lately. I love to see it. On this show, I'm excited to talk to Claude Atcho and dig into his recent release, Reading Black Books: How African American Literature Can Make Our Faith More Whole and Just. It's a smart and passionate work of literary criticism that considers landmarks like Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, Richard Wright's Native Son, Nella Larsen's Passing, and Toni Morrison's Beloved. That last one is going to be the focus of this episode. Claude and I are going to discuss Morrison's novel, his book, and the 1998 movie adaptation of Beloved, produced by and starring Oprah Winfrey. I'll bring Claude on in just a bit, but before I do that, a request that if you've enjoyed the TC podcast, would you mind leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts? We're just a handful of reviews away from reaching 100. And hitting that milestone will encourage Apple to put us on the radar of new listeners. So if you'd like to help us get to 100, it's easy to leave a review right now while you are listening in the Apple Podcast app. Go ahead and scroll down to click on the show link. It will say Think Christian. Then scroll down again until you get to ratings and reviews. You can leave one right there. We appreciate it. All right, let's bring on someone I'm glad to not only call a friend and a TC contributor, but now an author, Claude Atcho. Claude Atcho is here with his new book, which is one that I think listeners of the TC podcast would greatly appreciate. Reading Black Books: How African American Literature Can Make Our Faith More Whole and Just. Congrats, Claude. How has reception to the book been? Has anything surprised you in terms of the response? Does it seem to be connecting in ways you had hoped? What's it like now that it's out there?
Yeah, thank you, Josh. Yeah, it's been encouraging. It's been positive, positive, feedback, excitement. A couple of neat reviews up from Inglewood Review, Library Journal, and so that's been really encouraging. And then what's been neat is to just hear from different people. Obviously friends, but then other folks saying, "Hey, I really like this chapter," and so it's just neat to see what resonates with people.
Yeah.
Particular chapters folks connect with and why and just sort of, to create something, offer it, and then just see how others respond. I think the other thing that's been neat and surprising is how many people have commented on their desire to read the books that I talk about, which
Ah,
really validating and I think wise for those people, but also a little bit surprising just because that's extra work. But I'm encouraged that I've heard from a number of folks that want to take up that work, which is a good labor to engage in.
yeah, that's very cool. That's great to hear. And I myself, getting it in advance used that as an excuse, even knowing well in advance some of those books you
Yeah.
were that you were going to write about. I took the occasion to check off my list a few of the ones that I had not yet had a chance to read. So I like to hear that people are using it in that direction as well. There's some really wonderful Christian literary criticism going on in the book, and it's applied to a number of the great books of American literature, including Beloved, Toni Morrison's 1987 Pulitzer Prize winner. So, for those folks, Claude, those listeners who maybe haven't yet read Beloved, can you tell them what the novel is about and just a little bit about why that's one you chose to include in your book?
Sure. So, Beloved for Toni Morrison came out in 1987, and she was inspired by recovering, kind of, I think, in some of her archival research, the story of a black woman who had run away from plantation, being enslaved. And in the process of running away, the slave masters had tracked her down and were going to capture her and her children again. And in this moment, the woman kills one of her own children to spare them from essentially hell on earth, returning back to the plantation. And so Toni Morrison ended up really fleshing out and crafting a whole novelistic world out of that particular experience as a way of exploring and kind of reckoning with the obviously deep levels of trauma and suffering for African Americans through chattel slavery in our country. And so that's the genesis of the novel, and the way that the story is told is sort of these twists and turns of the memory of that traumatic event for Setha, the main protagonist, and her journey as she tries to sort of reclaim any sort of existence. And through the course of the novel, there's a return of different characters and friends that she knew from her life on the plantation. As in the present of the novel, she's settled in Ohio, and so it's sort of this novel that blends back and forth from the past and the present. And one of the reasons I wanted to cover it in the book is, is one of the best novels that we have of 20th century, and it's a really important one. It's one that in some places has kind of been removed from curriculum and from reading lists because of the difficulty of the subject matter. But it's important history for us because I think it's a novel that's exploring how is it possible to mend and to heal given this sort of experience for our people, but also in our nation. What does that sort of look like? And that just felt like a really critical book to engage with.
Yeah, as you said, if it is being pulled in some places, maybe even more critical now today than it might
Hmm.
have been a couple of years ago when it was already this foundational piece of literature. One of the voices that returns, Claude, that you were talking about these characters and voices that return is actually that baby in this
Hmm.
novel. So Morrison also constructs this as a ghost story, essentially.
Hmm.
At one point earlier on, we see that Setha and her other daughter are haunted in this house that they live in by the ghost of this baby. But then a little further along in the novel, we actually see in the form, if I'm right in understanding this, she arrives in the form at the age she would have been if she had lived. Is that
Hmm.
right?
Yeah, I
So
believe so.
sort of a
Yes.
late teens,
Yes.
younger woman, yeah. And that's Beloved. That's what the title of the novel comes from. And so it's very interesting that Morrison has taken this historical story and given it the lens of the supernatural in a
Yes.
way, and brings those two things together. It's one of the really distinctive things about the book. I think I read Beloved, if not high school, it probably was college. And for me, it was one of the first times that I recognized the generational reverberations of
Mm.
slavery. And so, appropriately, it's been a novel that has haunted me still.
Hmm.
It just comes back to me really whenever the national conversation turns to race in some way.
Hmm.
Beloved kind of rises back in the back of my mind and just reminds me how we got to this point and why that history still matters practically for folks of color today. So it's just an absolute landmark, a very difficult read,
Hmm.
as you've
Yeah.
already said, and I would absolutely agree with, but an essential one in a lot of ways. Now, in your book, writing about Beloved, one of the things that stood out to me, Claude, in your chapter on that novel is that you put it in the context of secularism, which I found interesting. No surprise. We say there's no such thing as secular here.
Yeah.
And so I liked thinking about it that way. I don't think that Beloved is necessarily considered a particularly religious book. There are religious elements in it, absolutely. But in terms of being written from a specifically religious perspective or something like that, but you do draw out the theological implications within it. And I wanted to read a little bit from your book, Claude, where you touch on this. In reading Beloved, it is difficult not to consider the shortcomings of secularism. It fails to adequately express and account for the depths of suffering and found evil in this life. Our healing cannot be found in secularism since it cannot fully account for the world in which we live, love, and suffer. And then later you say, our suffering may take place in the shadows, but as Beloved demonstrates, our healing happens in the light of community. Can you talk just a little bit more about that and maybe how you see Christianity as meeting both the suffering and the healing in ways that maybe secularism cannot?
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the things that's really interesting about Beloved is and I mentioned this in the chapters, none of the characters are surprised that the house that Setha lives in is haunted by the traumas of enslavement in the past. There's sort of this presumption that the world is an enchanted place and that evil, when it happens, it has effects that last longer than what we know and what we see. And I think part of that comes from, I would imagine, Toni Morrison's sort of Catholic faith and upbringing. But I think that's really instructive for us to think about these major evils and social ills that we deal with, that we're not simply engaging. The process of healing and remedying these things are not simply matters of information. They're not simply matters of sort of, can we muster human will and human strength to begin to like tackle these challenges? As important as those sort of things are, we actually have to realize that we're dealing with forces of evil that are hostile and against God's creation and against the flourishing of people. And I think any real accounting of healing at a personal level, societal level, a communal level that won't take that into account can't really reckon with the full scale of the problems that we're dealing with. I mean, we're recording this, a few weeks after we've suffered gun violence again and again in our country, and for us, for Christians to think that we're dealing with something that's just a matter of needing to convince people, but not also recognizing there's deep evil that is at work in these sort of things. We have to recognize both of those, and we have to give our full engagement in both areas. And I think Beloved to me is something that it does justice to the people that have suffered in these ways, because they believed that the world was enchanted, and they believed that they weren't just dealing with bad attitudes of people, but that actual evil was happening and is at work, and it needs to be pressed against so that we can heal into what God intends us to be.
As you're using that phrase deep evil, in my mind comes one of the effects used in the movie adaptation of Beloved, and it's when that throbbing red light appears in the home. And that's complicated because it's attached to Beloved the ghost, which is completely separate from the trauma that resulted in her death. So I don't mean to equate those two things, but it's one of those instances where the veil is pierced and you are shown cinematically that there is this other spiritual reality at play connected to what these characters have experienced. So I'm wondering maybe if we can switch to talking about the movie, which we wanted to bring in here. We are more of a pop culture podcast than a literature one, so wanted to find a way in to think about it in those terms as well. The movie Beloved came out in 1998, produced by Oprah Winfrey, who also stars as Setha, the mother, the main character, as you said. The director here is Jonathan Demme, who also made The Silence of the Lambs and Philadelphia and the great Talking Heads documentary, Stop Making Sense. In addition to Oprah Winfrey, the movie stars Danny Glover as Paul D. and Thandiwe Newton as Beloved when she does arrive as, again, the younger woman. So, Claude, this is a dreaded question I'm going to throw at you in a lot of ways, but it's the one that you are particularly equipped to consider, I think. You watched this, I believe, for the first time for our conversation. Did the film do justice to the book to you? It's not going to be its equal, but do you think it did justice, or did you have some significant qualms about the adaptation?
I thought the movie did justice to the book. I was surprised at how dedicated the movie was to the novel. Like it really follows the story closely. It tries to convey, one of the things that you mentioned earlier, Josh, was that the novel is hard to read, and it's hard to read in the subject matter, but also in the form. The chapters are not numbered. In fact, I was trying to look at something earlier for this conversation, and so I had to like count all the chapters to try to find it, or look through my scribblings. So the novel is hard to read in terms of the content, but also in the form. And there's these flashbacks and sort of the grammar changes and all these different sort of things to help you experience sort of the tidal waves of memory and trauma and pain. And the movie tries to do the same thing. And so through, as you mentioned, the lighting, some of the flashbacks, some of the kind of like splicing intercuts and all that sort of stuff. So I was actually really surprised at how intentional Oprah, the producers, Demi, the director, that whole team, how intentional they were to be faithful to the novel. And I just have a lot of respect for that because, as I was reading about the movie, it didn't do well. It didn't do well. Oprah has spoken in different interviews at length about how depressed she was that the film did not do well. And in retrospect, I read a interview that she participated in a few years back, maybe 5 or 6 years back, and looking back on Beloved, she commented that she was thankful that they didn't dumb it down for general audiences, but they tried to be as faithful as possible to the heart and kind of essence of the novel. So I think in those terms, I think the movie is faithful. I think the movie is successful. Obviously, very difficult to watch, but I think as an adaptation, it's faithful and successful on those terms.
Yeah, and in terms of it not doing well, you would think something like this would get attention from the Oscars, right? Historical, serious material.
Yeah.
We've seen more honest looks at American history be recognized in recent years, and in some ways, maybe Beloved was ahead of its time, or the Academy or the film culture was not ready for it yet, because I'm looking now as you're talking, and it was only nominated for one Academy
Yeah.
Award, and that was Best
Costume.
Costume Design.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
by Colleen Atwood, which is kind of crazy to think about.
Yeah, it
Again,
is.
if it had come out today, you like to think that people would be more open to this, a movie like this, despite that difficulty that you're talking about. And I would say, Claude, I haven't watched it since it came out, so this was a revisit for me, and you're right in its faithfulness. It does make for a more challenging viewing experience, and because of that, it struck me as a little bit clunkier on this rewatch, but I also think that's partly because when it came out, I had read the book within a few years earlier, so that experience was fresh to me. I could bring it as well. So here, being more removed from the book, I could see some of the clunkiness that I know some people did hold against it when it came out. But overall, I still think it's an incredible film and very unique in terms of its approach to this sort of
Mhm.
material and its literary source. There is, though, a lot of suffering. And there is that
Mhm.
question now of, does it at any point exploit some of the suffering that we see? I know that's a completely different conversation we are having these days when it comes to films that look at American history and Black suffering, and when are they possibly exploiting that? So I think that's a fair question to ask of this
Mhm.
movie as well.
Yeah.
But I also think it's balanced in Beloved, as it is in the book. I think the suffering in the book is balanced by this as well. These scenes in a place called the Clearing. So this is in the woods, and this is where Setha's mother-in-law, Baby Suggs, played by Bea Richards in the movie, gathers her neighbors to deliver spoken word performances of encouragement and self-love. We visit this place 3 times in the film, Claude, and again, though it's not an explicitly Christian ceremony, in your book, you draw out a parallel to the creational pattern in Genesis. I just love that. Had not occurred to me before, but one of those things when someone points it out, it just clicks, like, that makes
Mm.
total sense. So I'm wondering if you might be able to describe that a little bit too.
Sure, yeah. So the baby Suggs, as you mentioned, Suther's mother-in-law, she and again in the novel, these are flashbacks similar in the movie. And in this space, the clearing, baby Suggs, who in the novel we're told, she preaches, she goes to some of the different churches and preaches and is sort of this, a Moses, Harriet Tubman sort of figure, and it's through the strength of her heart. The text says continually that she's able to sort of give refreshment and dignity to her community, to her people. So in the clearing, she gathers all the people and she gives these clear sort of really liturgical orders to the people. Young children like smile, men come and let your children see you dance,
Mhm.
women weep for the living and the dead, and shout and like all these sort of things. So she gives these liturgical guidances that are healing, that are restorative to the people. These are things that they're not able to do in the confines of their daily existence. It's only in this separate community, in this kind of holy set apart space, that they can do these things, which are things that human beings are made to do, as those made in the image of God, to have the full range of human experience under God. And so she permits them, instructs them, commands them to do this. And as she does that, she gives the liturgical movements, but then she'll also exhort. And she'll say, "Yonder they don't love your flesh, but you love your flesh. You love your heart." And so I read that as encouraging the people to embrace their God givenness and to love their God given dignity, even if nobody else will. They must do that.
Here in this place, we are flesh, flesh that weeps, laughs, dances barefoot in the grass. Love your flesh. Love it hard. Yonder, they do not love our flesh. people. They do not love your hands. Those they only use, tie, bind, chop off, and leave empty. Love your hands.
And so in the chapter, I try to build on a writer named Sean Copeland. She talks about there's sort of a new knowledge that's given through Baby Suggs's exhortation that really creates a new people. And what's really beautiful about the way the text describes it in Beloved is that creation responds, right? The trees move, the wood shake, and it sort of has this pattern of let there be, and it was good that we see in Genesis. You see the sort of the same sort of textures there. And so to me, all of that kind of comes together as an attempt that Baby Suggs makes to return her people to creational goodness, where slavery is anti-creational, right? Stealing the dignity and life from people. Baby Suggs is trying to restore that and trying to lead people into new creation. And I think it's a really important encouragement when you think about what it means for people to heal from the things that we suffer and go through in whatever ways that looks like. It's to recognize our God-givenness, to recognize the dignity and the value that we have despite whatever anti-creational forces of suffering or sin or trauma or wounds would impose upon us, that we're more than our suffering. We're made and loved by God. And we have to return to these truths, and not just on our own, but together, the way that it's done in the clearing, so that we can heal and grow together. So I think those scenes are really important in the novel. I did appreciate the way the film comes back to them at important points. I think actually the movie sort of ends with another return to the clearing, which is different than the novel. It may not be the exact last scene, but it's in that sort of final stretch run of the film, which is different than the way the novel ends. So I can see them wanting to make that central in a way that it is central in the novel, and trying to heighten that for the film.
The filmmaking itself, too, in these scenes in the clearing is pretty incredible with the camera work, especially the dancing ones
Yeah.
where the people have gathered and are
Yes.
moving in a circle around Baby Suggs, and then the camera takes a circular movement the opposite direction, and it's capturing what you were just describing in the novel, how nature is responding. We feel, if you equate the camera with nature, with the wind, something like that at that moment, everything is in concert together. So they are very lovely scenes in the movie. So I have a last question for you, Claude, and then we can touch on any other lingering things that might be on your mind. But this is one that I was curious about. It's one that we can apply now to the movie Beloved that, again, not too many people were thinking of at the time, though there have long been claims about what directors should be telling what stories. I think that's more prominent in the culture now than it was when Beloved was made. Jonathan Demme, a white director, and absolutely an empathetic director. I think if you were going to point to someone at that time who you might trust with such material, you would trust him based on some of his other work. But his experience and understanding of Beloved, the novel, is absolutely different than that of an African American filmmaker. My experience of reading Beloved and watching the movie is different than yours, Claude. So just curious, thinking about that, where we are now, what your feelings are on having someone like Demi be at the head of this particular movie.
Yeah, I've been thinking about that. That's a hard one. That's complicated. I mean, I'm glad that this movie exists and was made, and I'm glad that Oprah was a part of the producers to bring this to life. So I know it wasn't there was a diverse team that was bringing this to life, and I think in this situation, the fact that they chose to be so true to the novel, to me, says a lot about, at least from the outside, the sort of posture that was taken from the director, across the board, that there was a desire to really venerate and respect what Morrison had crafted and to put that forward without any shortcuts. And so I really just commend that. So I think in this situation, I feel like it works. I do, yeah, I do wonder about that. I was even thinking about, a movie that came out around this time that I did see in the theaters at the time. My uncle made me see it. I didn't want to. Was the year before Amistad,
Mm,
by Steven Spielberg. So that came out in '97. The story of black slaves coming over in their sort of revolt, if I remember the plotline
yeah,
correctly.
the Middle
And
Passage,
so,
yeah.
Yeah, and I wonder, I mean, I haven't seen that recently, like, I don't know, I think the 2 feels of those films are really different, you know? And so I think in this case, because there was such a clear decision to really hold true to what to Morrison's vision, I think it works, but it's such a complicated and difficult question. To me, it's sort of something that has to kind of be worked through case by
Yeah.
case. You know, I was even thinking about, I mean, sometimes the situation is sometimes these movies won't get made unless there's certain directors attached that have the money behind this. So then you get into the spot, well, do you want the story to be told or do you not want it to be
Hmm.
told? And so I don't know. I feel like that's something I don't think I have a good answer to.
No, that's helpful. It gives me some good context for thinking about it. I think that power question is hopefully shifting a little bit now, where you wouldn't necessarily. I think of someone like Barry Jenkins making the Underground Railroad series and how instrumental he was, and that I think his involvement was seen as it should have been as an absolute plus, not just something that, needed to be added on, that it was crucial to have him not only for who he is as a black filmmaker, but for what he brings in terms of his talent to a story like that. And your context of Amistad, I had not thought of that, is really intriguing. I have not seen Amistad probably in as long as I've seen Beloved, and so I may have this wrong, but my memory is that that story does turn towards almost legislation and
It
become
does. It does. Yeah.
right, a story
Yeah.
of sort of the white
It
response,
does.
and
Yep.
as much as we might want to be on the side of those responses, it is leaving the black space for a white space in what is absolutely, a story of those people who are being brought over and what they have suffered. That's kind of like a launching pad, which maybe does seem a little wrong. And yeah, in comparison to that, absolutely Beloved, the attention is where it should be. And it's still difficult, as you're saying, like if a talented black filmmaker had been given this material, obviously it would have been looked very different from what we get from Demi. But I do think there was care to place the attention where it should be. And probably Winfrey's involvement
Hmm.
is crucial to that,
Totally.
It should probably just end on the fact that she's incredible in
She's
this
great.
movie. I mean,
Yep.
it's just I know she has acted since, but I don't and maybe it was a response to, how this movie was responded to, that it didn't really make as much of an impact as she had hoped. I don't think she's taken on anything quite as monumental, and it's a little bit of a loss, I would say, for us because the layers she brings to this performance in an incredibly difficult character. Do we want to really root for Setha? Do we,
Hmm.
at sometimes the movie seems we should root more for Beloved.
Hmm.
And that's the trick that the book itself is
Yeah.
playing with a little bit, and so for Winfrey to be able to bring us along through all those difficulties is quite incredible. Was there a maybe that's a good question to throw at you as we wrap up here. Was there a performance or a character where you're like, "Yeah, that's it more than any of the others?"
I think Oprah was amazing. There's a couple, you mentioned the clearing scene. The other standout scenes are the moment where Setha, obviously played by Oprah, she realizes who Beloved is, and you kind of get this turn. You see her whole face. She's incredible in the film. And also the actress that plays Denver, I believe
Yes.
it's Kimberly.
Kimberly Elise.
Mhm. I mean, also just remarkable performance as well. So those would be the two I think that just really stand out in terms of bringing so much to really obviously difficult story and difficult characters and I love the way I mean this. The Denver character, her arc, her journey through the story is, I think, in the midst of a story that's deeply painful, has a true hope to it. And so I just thought that was captured perfectly.
Yeah, and the story sort of shifts a little bit to her, and her experience of all this and how she is going to move on from how she experienced the trauma, what her next life is going to look like or her life beyond her experience with her mother. And yeah, Kimberly Elise is great too, and Danny Glover can do no
Yeah,
wrong. So from the casting, they
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 do
got
well.
that right,
Yes.
absolutely. Anything else you wanted to touch on or stray thoughts you had about the movie or you wanted to bring up about the novel itself that you think is good to know?
Not really. I mean, I think I would encourage people. The movie, as you said, is well done, well made, and I would encourage people to read the novel. And I would encourage people to read the novel, read it with others. I think it's an important work to process, hold space for, and to engage with it. This is the epigraph is that for 60 million and more. So it's an important part of our story as a collective people, as a nation. And so I just would encourage people to give the space and make the space to engage in that if they haven't read this previous.
Yeah, I like the idea of reading with others because then you'll have someone else to get your bearings
Yeah.
with, just emotionally, but also in terms of format
Hmm.
too, because I had forgotten that, but you're right. It is hard to get your bearings a little bit. What part of the story are we at? Whose eyes are we seeing this through a little bit? I think that's ultimately part of the mastery of the book when you step back and you're done and you see how this tapestry has been woven. But in the midst of it, it can be a little disorienting. So that's one good thing. One helpful thing would be to read it
Yeah.
alongside others. And then use your book as sort of a guide, a discussion point.
Yeah.
There are great things in there where people can say, "All right, let's read this chapter and have a gathering and talk about what this book meant to us." Any book related events along those lines that listeners should maybe know about, or other places you're going to be talking about it if they want to hear more that you want to mention, Claude?
Yeah, thanks. I'll be at the Glen Workshop in Asheville, North Carolina in July, the week of the 24th. I mean, I believe people can still sign up for that if you're able to make your way over. It'll be obviously wonderful to meet you and to be a part of that. I'm teaching a seminar on some of these books that I cover in my book, Baldwin, Ellison, some of the classics of 20th century African American literature. So that'd be a great thing. And yeah, I'll be popping around on some different podcasts in the next couple months, and so keep an eye out for that. And you can see what I'm up to on Twitter. Usually loosely active there. So
Loosely active. I like that.
loosely,
Sounds like a healthy approach.
yeah. It's good for everyone. Just minimally active.
The Glenn Workshop, they put out amazing stuff. So I was really excited to see that you're going to be a part of that. And another thing you've done, I don't know how we got you to do this in the midst of all this book craziness, but at the Think Christian website, you did write about the new Kendrick Lamar album
Yes.
for us. So
Yeah.
Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers. Kendrick stuff, always a lot to wrap your
Yeah.
head around, and you have given us a really good way, an entry point in for doing that. So we'll link to that in the show notes so people can find it at thinkchristian.net and the Glenn Workshop stuff as well. Congrats again on the book. Thank you for your time, and we'll catch up with you again down the road. All right, Claude?
Thank you. Appreciate it.
We're going to wrap things up there for this episode. Hopefully, you've been intrigued to check out Claude's book, Reading Black Books. If you read our articles over at thinkchristian.net, you'll find it's doing similar work in terms of applying a theological lens to art. So it's very much of a piece with TC. Now, if for some reason you don't read the work of Claude and others over at the website, the easiest way to keep up with our articles is to sign up to subscribe to receive our emails. You can do that at thinkchristian.net/subscribe. If you want to keep up with us on Twitter or Facebook, just follow us at Think Christian. Over on YouTube, we do have video versions of this show as well as some other video content, so look for the Think Christian YouTube channel. The TC Podcast is a listener-supported program of Reframe Ministries, a family of programs designed to help you see your whole life reframed by God's gospel story. Visit reframeministries.org for more info. Our audio engineer and post-production supervisor is John Reeder, and Reframe's co-director overseeing content strategy is Robin Baslin. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back again in a couple of weeks to consider how another aspect of our pop culture fandom connects with our faith.